Hello there from India, and we are live for this amazing session as a part of the Global Hint series we have. So, this is the fifth episode in the second season of Global Hint. Last time we had an amazing podcast session with Dr. Matra, and we had discussed about risk related strategies and how the current normative frameworks have been emerging, like the Indo Pacific, for example. Now we have this episode with Dr. Robert Lyman, and I will introduce our guest this evening. So, in this podcast, we're going to discuss Dr. Lyman's book, an upcoming book, which is to be, I believe, published in November, or which is released by November, let's say. And the same is on the Second World War's history with respect to India, Japan, Burma, and of course, the role of Britain. And of course, we will be discussing the nuances and the avenues which have still not been discussed for now. So, let me introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Lyman. Dr. Robert Lyman is a writer and historian. After finishing his 20-year career in the British Army in 2001, he has published widely on the Second World War in Europe, North Africa, and Asia. He was also the BBC's historical advisor for the VJ commemorations in 2015 and 2020 and is a regular contributor to documentary films on the aspects of war. He's also an elected fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and he has been a trustee of the Kohima Educational Trust since 2004. So, sir, it's a pleasure to have you on board, and welcome to Global Hint.
It's a great pleasure for me to join you this evening. Thank you for inviting me.
Indeed. So my very first question, so as to make some context for the viewers, the very basic question which everyone might have asked, what should be said as the inspiring aspect of your book? What did inspire you to write a book on this specific aspect of the Second World War in Asia?
Well, there are a number of themes that came back together, and thank you for the question. It's a very important one. I have been studying the war in Asia for 30 years, and I have to admit that for many years I undertook my research and my writing on the basis of what I would call received knowledge and received wisdom about the war, what the war meant to the Allies who were fighting it. And I inherited those almost subconsciously without really thinking about the impact of the war on other actors. And it's only in recent years that I've come to the conclusion that actually we have lost the main thread of the war in the Far East, which was this amazing cataclysm between an emerging empire, military empire of Japan, and a declining British empire in India and the Southeast Asia, and a growing sense of Indian nationalism, Indian statehood, and Indian identity that all came together in war in 1942-45. So I wrote the book. The book is a traditional military history. As one of my friends has described it, it's a story of generals talking to generals. But there is a very important series of subtexts running throughout the book. And the first and most important one is about Indian identity. And it's about Indian statehood, and it's about an emerging India. It's not so much a story about Indians and the Raj. It's a story about Indians voluntarily opposing the militarism of Japan and looking forward to a new future. And you asked the question, what's prompted me to write it? Well, for many years, you might know that I have almost been a lone voice in arguing that India needs to take more recognition of its role in fighting the Japanese, in particular in the Second World War, because it was a tremendously successful national effort. It was an effort that in part created the new India. But of course, you will all know, all your listeners will know that in India, the 1947 myths are predominant, and the myths in 1947 about the Indian National Army were important to be able to create a new India. In France, we had the same thing. We had the idea that de Gaulle called an idea of France, a new idea of France. And in India, we had the same thing. We had a new idea of India that wasn't actually based on reality. And I'm really excited about the fact that many Indian historians and writers and ordinary people are now beginning to realize actually there was an Indian history prior to 1947. And it's an exciting and a formative one. My argument essentially is that the Indian Army rebuilt itself from 1942 to 44 and 45, was tremendously successful in the war against Japan, defeated Japan militarily. We had the largest volunteer army in the world from India. 2.5 million men and women joined the Indian Army during the Second World War. They joined voluntarily of their own agency. They didn't join to defend the Raj. They joined to defend India. And that's the fundamental issue that we need to deal with. The problem with history is that we often lose its nuance. We have a binary view of history all too often, which says, well, the people who fought for the Indian Army were servants or slaves of the Raj. They didn't have any personal agency. They didn't know what they were doing. And I think that's just not true. I think the really important thing for us to grasp is that Indians joined the army. They joined the Indian Armed Forces. We saw a massive rebuilding of India economically and militarily between 1943 and 45. And it was this resurgence of Indian greatness that just defeated the Japanese armies in Burma. And I said at the outset that I had always studied with this received notion about the Second World War, which was that it was a major clash between the Allies, who were effectively Soviet Union, United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany and Japan. If we hold that paradigm, to that paradigm, we entirely ignore the really strategic, immense contribution of India and the wider British Empire, but fundamentally India. Let me just put it in a nutshell. If it wasn't for pre-partition India, Britain and America would not have defeated the Japanese. It's really as simple as that. We would not have had the American hump airlift from the Brahmaputra Valley in Upper Assam into Yunnan and China. We wouldn't have had the defeat of the Japanese in Burma and India. So it's a long answer to your question, but they're the things that drove me to write the book in the first place.
And I must say that we will be decoupling them and decluttering them as the discussion goes ahead. So my next question is much about South Asia and the history of the Second World War. Yeah, you wish to add something, sir? Yeah.
Well, I would simply make the observation that when we, right across the world, look at the war against Japan, I would say 95% of our observations and our focus is on the Pacific theater. And if you talk to the man in the street in Delhi or anywhere else in India or anywhere in the world, they would be, and if they knew something about the Second World War, they might be able to mention Guadalcanal to you. They might be able to mention Iwo Jima. They might be able to mention Okinawa. But very few people would be able to talk to you about Imphal and Kohima or Mektila or Mandalay. And yet I have the very strong view that those battles that I've just described were as significant, perhaps even more significant than the island hopping campaign. So it's a very interesting general view about the Second World War, that we know what we know, we don't know what we don't know. And we have been, for lots of good reasons, I think, we have been pushed into binary routes, binary perspectives, one-way streets in terms of our understanding of the Second World War. And that's very true in India. India has, of course, went through the pain of partition in 1947. And in order, as I said at the outset, in order to be able to create some founding stories about the new India and the new Pakistan, largely disposed of anything that had happened during the Second World War. And that is now changing. And the issue with the Pacific is that the Pacific campaign was only a very small, well, it was a significant part geographically of the war against Japan. But the other part of the war against Japan was effectively Burma. And I just need to say that when I talk about the Burma campaign, I include China in that, because the Burma campaign was the focus for Allied efforts to support the Chinese government's war against Japanese invaders in China. The only reason Japan was in Burma was to close the Burma Road from Rangoon to Lashio to Yunnan. So that's why it's so incredibly important. If we ignore China and Burma and India in our discussion about the strategic construct of the Second World War in Asia, we have missed at least half of what went on.
Indeed. So I would say that this additional comment completes half part of my second question, but I still will ask the question. So we have seen that, and this might be inspiring because people who would read the book in future and those who are interested in South Asia and the emerging idea of the Indo-Pacific from a maritime and other perspectives which are related to, they might be interested in the Second World War history, because that is true that it's a mythical thing that people used to consider that India and the Indian National Army, of let's say the Indian soldiers, were not even capable to help enough. But the fact is that they have helped the British in the Second World War, and that is something which cannot be forgotten at all. So the question is very simple. So we know that there is a region of South Asia, and within South Asia, the centrality of India has actually started to emerge. Even UK and the United States separately have want their own approaches to their own quads, I would say. So if we see the perspective of your book and the Second World War history, uh, if let's assume that there could have been a concept like Indo-Pacific in that, understanding, because it's a normative idea. Even transatlantic partnership and all of these are normative concepts. How could we have understood it, and how much, I would say, practical these are when it comes to understanding them from your book, and I would say also the Second World War history.
Well, it's a very important concept, of course, and there are a number of strands to it. The first thing that I would say is that um, India operated until 1942 within the context of the Raj. The Raj effectively run from Delhi, but under the auspices of London. So it was largely run to two levels: one for imperial purposes, but actually, secondly, we mustn't forget this: the empire, certainly so far as India was concerned, was run for India's purposes. India was a united country under the Raj. And I think it's really important for us to consider the government of India as opposed to the Raj. So the Raj has a pejorative term, has a pejorative context to it now. And people do get the view that when we talk about the Raj, we talk about India being puppets on a string to London. And that just wasn't the case. What is more true to say is that the Indian government was exerting its own prerogatives really from the 1920s onwards and determining what was important for India. And this is an important dimension in the development of the empire, the British Empire in India. It's wrong to view the empire in India as being in any way static and any way simply existing in one place and at one time, say in 1858, for the purposes of London. That's just not true. So here we have 1920s and 1930s, India, the Indian government suddenly becoming aware of the threats to its own security. Now, those threats to its security extended outside of India itself because of the colonial diaspora. So large numbers of Indians traveled into the Pacific following the British rupee. They particularly went to Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. So we had all of a sudden this ink stain effect of Indian immigration and therefore of Indian interests, and a growing realization in the 1930s that India was not protecting itself and not controlling its borders and not controlling its interests in a way that a united state could and should do. In fact, the primary responsibility of a state, I argue in the book, is to protect its people. And in the absence of India doing that, then London had to do it. But London did it very badly because the reality is in the 1920s and 30s, the British Empire was very, very, very widely spread. It was like, spreading a very tiny pat of military butter on a very large slice of colonial bread. So there's a really important concept here about the Indo-Pacific and Indian interests extending into Asia. And of course, if you have those interests and you're not able to protect them or even articulate them, then you are at the mercy of those countries that are able to articulate them and exercise power and authority where they want to. I mean, the current status of China in East Asia is an absolutely perfect case in point. And in the 1930s, Japan, of course, was exercising its military power and exerting its will in the Pacific in a way that suited itself. And this is a fundamental reality of international relations. And so we have this problem of an immature Indian government, so immature in the sense of not having full power to itself and not having the military power to control its borders, to defend itself, being opposed by Japan. And of course, the consequence of that was, in retrospect, very easy to see. 1941, 42, with the collapse of the British Empire in Malaya and Singapore and Burma was a consequence of a state being unable to protect its interests in a new world. And I think that's one of the things that Britain left India. And in the years after that, India built up its military power. It built up military power as an expression of itself, and it built up its military power in respect of its determination to protect its interests and wherever they might be in the region. So although I wouldn't describe modern India as an imperial power, it is nevertheless a country with a very strong sense of self and a very strong sense of identity and a determination to protect its interests in its periphery. So, we have quite remarkable, and that is a legacy of the Second World War. So the way that Indian defense is currently constructed makes entire sense to me, because as a country, India is determined to protect its periphery. It's not expansionist. It's not exclusionary in the sense that it wants to secure power for its own good outside of its territorial area, but it is determined to protect it robustly. And that is directly a consequence of 1942 to 45. And, we can't forget that. One of the facts about history is that it gives us context for what we do now. It gives us context for the period from 1947 to 48. So I would describe the period before 47, the period of the war against Japan, as being really definitive in enabling. It's hidden, no one talks about it, but it's definitive in enabling India to understand what it should be doing about protecting its state, about extending its, strengthening its borders, about pushing back against those states and those powers that threaten Indian interests, not necessarily in a strongly military way, but in a way that can be firmly understood by those countries that are undertaking or delivering those threats. I mean, I don't need to be explicit about where those threats come from. We know where they come from, and they're very obvious. And my point solely is that between 1942 and 1945, India grew up. It recognized that the military force it was able to develop and deploy was a very important part of statehood, modern statehood. So my argument in the book, peripherally, but I make it at the end, is that Indian nationhood, that nationhood which received at independence, was vouchsafed for. It was protected by the fact that it had a strong sense of its military identity and could use that military identity to protect its territorial situation.
Indeed. Before we go on with the third question, I just have a follow-up question, since we have discussed about the modern Indian state post-independence in that sense. So, and this is just a out of context question, but it is related to it to just understand the history in those times. Now, after India was included in the United Nations and India became a part of the international community as an independent country, practically speaking, we saw that India adopted the non-aligned movement approach towards the Cold War era countries. And we see that despite the fact that India had capability when it comes to its air force per se, India still did not get its advantage in the Indo-Sino War, which is related to the Aksai Chin region. So if we consider the context that we are trying to describe here, do we see some changes in trend? And if we take the Sino-Indo War of 1962 in that context, how would you describe that?
Well, I would describe it as a different sort of maturity. So I would say that India, and I followed this for many years, with the non-aligned movement in particular, and its determination to create a military deterrent, a powerful military deterrent, and to create the permanent structures and defense that would prevent attack, has been, I believe that India has managed its defense issues and its strategic issues and its security issues with immense maturity, because it's very easy to overuse military force. And one of the problems that, of course, the world has seen in the Cold War is the creation of two superpower blocks, of course, East versus West, with all the armaments associated with it, built on the basis, of course, of deterrence, and not being used during the Second World War, during the Cold War, of course. But of course, being used in peripheral wars around the world as a consequence. India hasn't done that. India has retained to itself the right to defend itself without using its military force aggressively against third parties. And that's why I would describe it as remarkably mature. India's army, if you look very closely at it, is a national army, and it's designed to do the things that I described in your earlier question, which is to protect the territorial integrity and the identity of India as a nation, without it being used to exploit its power in any other ways. And this is a fundamental consequence, in my view, of Indian democracy. And Indian democracy, again, I think was seen very, very clearly in the years between 1942 and 45 in the voluntary nature of the expansion of the armed forces. I mean, just imagine this. Could the Allies have defended India and defeated the Japanese in Burma without the voluntary, the democratic determination of 2.5 million people to join the armed forces to fight the Japanese? The answer is no. And I think that tradition is carried on. It's a very vibrant, noisy democracy. But I mean, in terms of the power of democracy, I think the maturity is very, very evident in the way that India decided not to go one way or the other during the Cold War and remained independent, and it retained its virtue as a consequence. It's a very important point, actually. It's and it remains a fundamental characteristic of India today.
That's a really interesting perspective, I must say. So my next question is related to the Battle of Kohima, and then we'll go a little bit more deeper into the role of Indian troops in the Second World War in general. So so how does the book describe the role of the Battle of Kohima in terms of being one of the turning points of the Second World War? We know that there are various turning points. It starts from Europe to Asia Pacific and so on. But of course, Battle of Kohima is one of them. So how do you see it as one of the turning points in the Second World War?
Well, I believe, and I've thought about this long and hard, and I wondered whether in previous years I've exaggerated, but on coming back to it, I don't think I have. The Battle of Kohima and Imphal, they were two battles in the same campaign, were fundamentally important to the security and defense of India in 1944, but they were also very important in terms of the defeat of the Japanese. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So I do believe that Kohima Imphal was one of the big turning points of the Second World War. They weren't large battles. I mean, the Japanese army, the 15th Army that came into India in 1944 was about 100,000 men strong under General Mutaguchi Renya. And there were much larger battles in Eastern Europe and so on. But if you look at the turning points in the Second World War, look at Midway in 1942, look at Stalingrad, which really turned the tide in the Soviet Union. We can ask ourselves the question, is that the same? Did the same thing happen in Kohima? And every time I look at it, I come to the same conclusion that yes, it was a dramatic turning point. Why? For two reasons. The first point is that the Japanese were defeated. A formed up Japanese army, the 15th Army, very significant army. It was weak in armor and weak in artillery and weak in air power, but it was still a very significant formed up infantry-based army, was defeated. And this was the first time that a formed up Japanese army had been defeated in the Second World War. And that's very important for the Japanese psyche. If you go to Japan today, and I first went in 2000 and started talking to the Japanese about the war, I was intrigued to discover that when they thought about the Second World War, they talked about it, they didn't talk first about Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal. They talked about Imphal, by which I mean also Kohima. Imphal psychologically was a very, very important battle for the Japanese because they were defeated. It was the end of this reign of Japanese military invincibility in the Far East. Now, whilst the Japanese had been defeated at Guadalcanal and other places in the island hopping campaign, they had never been defeated on such a scale. And a Japanese army, remember that the Japanese army, this army under Mutaguchi Renya, was an expression of Japanese martial virility. This was an expression of what Japan was and what it considered itself to be, which was the sword of the emperor. And it was defeated. And it wasn't just defeated by the British. It was defeated by an allied army made up predominantly of Indian soldiers. Now, this is also important when we consider the Japanese psychology and their approach to war. Here they were coming into the Far East, believing that the Indians were lackeys of the British colonial imperialists, and that India would collapse like dominoes as soon as the Japanese came up to its border. And nothing of the kind happened. In fact, large numbers of Indians joined the Indian army to fight against the Japanese. We need to consider that many, if not most, of the soldiers who were fighting the Japanese in 1944 weren't in the army in 1942. They joined the army in 1943. They were then trained for 9 to 11 months, and then they were. So if you were a Japanese officer and you ask yourself the question, well, why are these Indians fighting against me? You needed to be honest in explaining to yourself that actually the Indians didn't believe that they didn't want to be freed by this new form of Asia for the Asiatics, because they recognized that it was Asia for the Japanese. So that's the first point. That's the first reason why it's very important. The second is for propaganda reasons. The Japanese believed, well, let me start that again. Some of the Japanese, Mutaguchi Renya in particular, believed that if he were to send troops into the Brahmaputra Valley, if they were to move into Dimapur and maybe go as far as Guwahati, Bengal, of course, this boiling pot of Indian national expression, would boil over and the whole Raj would collapse. And of course, Subhas Chandra Bose was very, very instrumental in persuading Mutaguchi and some other senior Japanese officers that indeed would be the case. And Subhas Chandra Bose was given sort of political control of the Indian National Army, very small by that stage, about 16,000 men, in order to be the vanguard of Indians rescuing India from colonialism. None of that happened. But it's very important to think what might have happened had Mutaguchi managed to get into the Brahmaputra Valley. So this was Assam. This was India proper. There is a case for arguing that Manipur was on the edge of India. It wasn't really India. India wasn't threatened by the Japanese coming in. But think what might have happened had Japanese soldiers managed to pour into the Brahmaputra Valley, threaten Dimapur, take Dimapur, which they could have done, and threaten Guwahati. I mean, politically, the Raj would have been under enormous pressure. Militarily and strategically, it would have meant that the American hump airlift, which was running out of Dinjan and Chabua in the northern Brahmaputra Valley, would have stopped as well, because all those supplies came up the Brahmaputra via Dimapur, the railway into the hills. And we then would have failed. The Allies would have failed to support China. If we had lost the Brahmaputra Valley, that would have been, a strategic blow of immense significance. And I think we all forget that. I mean, there are very, very few people, historians, academics, writers nowadays, who are really focused on the strategic importance to the Allied cause and fighting the Japanese of China and of the American airlift into China itself. Let me just talk very quickly about that. The American airlift, the hump airlift, was one of the most significant logistical feats ever undertaken in human history, certainly to that point. And the great success of the hump airlift, which people have just generally forgotten about, was the blueprint for the Berlin airlift a few years later. But over those 3 years, 1942 to the start of 1945, about 650,000 tons were flown into China. That's the equivalent of about 240 sorties, so aircraft flights a day, flying the 4 hours from Chabua into Yunnan. Enormous cost, enormous expense. But by that activity, it kept Chiang Kai-shek loyal to the Allied cause and continuing to fight the Japanese in China, and therefore freeing them up from the island hopping campaign that was primarily an American operation from 1945, and freeing them up from opposing the Allied armies in Burma. So very, very significant strategically. So a long answer to your question: was Kohima a turning point, the Battle of Kohima, a turning point in the war? Absolutely, yes. The Japanese were defeated. They were defeated by an army that had grown in maturity, grown in power, very well led, well equipped, fighting through the monsoon, remember, as well. Just imagine how horrible that must have been. And yet they defeated the Japanese. And also they prevented the Japanese from pulling one of the strategic rungs out of the Allied ladder by ending up in the Brahmaputra Valley.
I must say that the mention of the Chinese context and, of course, the very situation in the Brahmaputra Valley is something which many people really don't know. I mean, I would also very humbly say that I'm one of the first persons to know this. But, anyways, so my next question is more about understanding estimations, and that is an offbeat question, but it's still related to. We know that with respect to Japan, the contribution of Indian soldiers is amazing. But even in general, if we talk about, let's say, the First World War and the Second World War, we at least know that Indian soldiers have represented the British in various parts of the world. So if you can estimate about the, in maybe in numbers and also in factual aspects, like where Indian soldiers have represented the Raj and how have they contributed and how have they mobilized. So that can also give some context.
It's a great question, and it's largely been forgotten, and it's worth just talking through it now, because between the Indian Army provided an extraordinary commitment to the Allied armies in France and in the First World War, very, very significant. And that allowed the Indian Army to conceive of itself in the 1920s and 30s as an army that could support the British if there was ever a war of that kind again. But the most important thing that happened in the 1920s is that the Indian Army was conceived by Britain and in India as a mechanism for backfilling or supporting the British Army across the empire. So its army was infantry based, had very little artillery, had very little proper cavalry. It wasn't mechanized. There were very few drivers in India at the time, of course, because the Indian economy wasn't mechanized. And so it had limited utility until the start of the Second World War. In expansion plans in 1938, led by General Sir Claude Auchinleck, a deployable division was created in the Indian Army called the 4th Indian Division. And that was deployed in 1939 at the start of the war. And Indian soldiers played a very significant role in the fighting in North Africa and in Iran and Iraq and Eritrea and the Horn of Africa. Very, very important to understand that. But we also need to remember that to a large extent, the 4th Indian Division then as conceived, and the Indian Army as a whole as conceived until about 1940, was designed to be effectively little more, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, little more than a constabulary, an armed constabulary. And this is where the great transformation took place. And there have been a number of really good books in recent years that have described this transformation of an Indian army from an infantry-based armed constabulary into a very powerful all-arms fighting organization. And that's what it was. So by 1945, if I just provide you the contrast, in 1945, the Indian Army was deploying modern tanks, Sherman tanks. It was deploying the full panoply of air power, with the exception of bombers, but fighter ground attack in support of their armies. It was deploying artillery, and it was deploying armored infantry in a modern mobile role in a way that it was never conceived to be. So I often tell people, it's quite common in the circles in which I talk about these things, that the British Army in Normandy in 1944 was largely a new army. It was an army that had been recruited in 1942 and 43, but it was an army that was largely new. There were very few troops, formations that had fought through North Africa and Italy that were actually fighting in 1944 in Europe. Well, it's exactly the same in 1944 in Imphal and Kohima, so in Eastern India, in Manipur and Assam, and exactly the same in 1945. This was a new army. It was trained from scratch to do a new job, vast numbers, and it was demonstrably successful. This is the important thing. It didn't need a generation to 25 years of military or martial power to be able to achieve this military success. It did it in less than a year. This is the really important point, because for most of the imperial period, the period from 1858 onwards, the British had this idea of martial races forming the basis of the Indian Army. Only a few of the northern Indian races actually could be trusted to be proper soldiers. This is the idea of the martial concept, martial races concept, which the Second World War demonstrated to be entirely wrong, because India in 1943 recruited for its army right across the length and breadth of India. And in 1944, we saw a new army, representative of the whole of India, not just the martial races, and trained to fight a peer enemy with armor, artillery, and all the modern panoply of weapons and logistics, and effectively to lead it itself. And it defeated the Japanese. I mean, this is the thing that we need to remind ourselves. I talked right at the start about historians and writers often writing about received wisdom, the things that they've always been taught and always believe in, and not leaving those structures behind. I think I've made a paradigm shift in recent years away from that thinking for myself to recognizing actually that this was not a British war. This was not a British army. There were British officers commanding it, of course, but these were officers who had spent their entire careers in the Indian Army and actually considered themselves Indian, not British, commanding Indian troops. And it was an Indian Army that was able to step up and undertake this training and deploy and defeat the Japanese. And that's the fundamental kernel of my thesis and of my book. And it's it's the idea that I want Indians to grasp. The utility of the Indian soldier in 1944 and what the Indian soldier in 1944 was able to achieve on the battlefield was far, far different to what it was designed to achieve in 1939 and 40. It was a different animal completely. And that's what we need to understand.
I must say that's a very interesting perspective. Considering that, my next question is about Subhash Chandra Bose and the role of the INA that he formulated. You told that there were merely 16, 20 or something like thousands of soldiers. So when it comes to the role of Subhash Chandra Bose's INA, we all know that there is of course not a consensus on Subhash Chandra Bose's role and where he went and all of that. I'm not getting on that question, but the main question with regards to the Second World War is on the point as to how was he contributive, because we know that he tried to partner with the Axis powers and then something else happened, many things. So if you can describe about the role of the INA and how much effective that was or not, but what essential role did Bose had?
Yes. Okay. So I'll talk about Subhash Chandra Bose on a number of levels. So militarily, and I know that this is a sensitive subject, and I've got some very good friends in India who might be listening to this podcast who have slightly different views to me. But I'll lay out my stall and explain my view. So in 1944, yes, the Indian National Army comprised a couple of divisions of about two divisions of 16,000 men. And this is mainly because the Japanese had reduced it in size from about the 40,000 that it had been in 1942. And of course, the Indian National Army had been made up of soldiers from the Indian Army who had been taken prisoner in Malaya and Singapore and a small number in Burma in 1942 and had been persuaded to join the Japanese as an Indian National Army to fight the British. And it's important to understand that propaganda idea that this was a war, a racist war, well, not a racist war, it was a colonial war, it was a Japanese or an Asian empire, or the Asian countries were coming together to throw out the colonialists. The irony was actually lost on many participants at the time, that actually they were simply being asked to swap one colonial oppressor for another. But anyway, we'll leave that by the by. By 1944, by the end of 1943 and early 1944, the INA was important for the idea that the INA represented, that the idea that this was an Indian organization that was standing up for oppressed Indians and would recover India for Indians. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case at all. The Indian National Army was a tool of the Japanese from start to finish, and this was the great tragedy of it. So many well-meaning Indians, and I do not blame any Indian at all for joining the INA. I mean, I might have done it myself. This was a situation where it appeared that the Indian government had failed them. The British had failed them. So what future was there in the British Empire? So I don't judge Indians for joining the INA, but the tragedy is that throughout its short career, its short life, the INA was a tool of the Japanese, and it was a tool of the Japanese to enable to add a political gloss to the invasion of India, the March on Delhi in 1944. Militarily, the INA failed. It didn't achieve much at all in terms of battle. But the idea of the INA, of course, was very powerful in 1946 and 47, when the empire, the British Empire, was coming to an end, and this idea of the INA being defenders of Indian nationhood was propagandized very strongly in India. Nehru, the retired barrister, came back and to put his robes on in order to defend the INA defendants in the Red Court of 1946. So the idea of the INA politically was very important. And as you know, the INA, if people talk about the end of colonialism and the role of the Indian Army in the Second World War, many of them will immediately say, well, the INA played a very significant part. I don't believe that to be true actually, but it's true in terms of its propaganda and its myth-making value. So that's the point about the INA. It didn't achieve anything militarily. It was a tool of the Japanese, and tragically, most members of the INA never saw that. They never saw that they were being used by Japan, quite ruthlessly, in fact, to achieve Japanese military objectives with no consideration for the Indians. But the myth of the INA will never go away. It's so strongly rooted in India that it's one of those things that it's never worth getting into an argument about, because it's a little bit like, one of those aspects of religious belief. You either believe it or you don't. And if you believe it, there's no point taking that God out of people's lives. I have discovered that over the years. So rational argument often doesn't work when I'm discussing the INA in India. But it's an important part of the entire story. There's no doubt about it.
Indeed, I must agree on that. And that's why I limited the question to the role of them and not the political aftermath of the leader. So the next question is more about the Cantonese, which is, of course, I would say, those people who formed Taiwan in the coming days, not coming days, years.
Yeah.
You very well described about how the Chinese, cooperated with the Allies. So when it comes to, let us assume that the normative framework of Indo-Pacific could be taken again into the context. So how did the Cantonese manage against the Japanese, and what inspiration when it comes to understanding military strategy and other geopolitical aspects related to it could be taken up? So if you can describe about the role of the Cantonese.
It's a great question. I was very honored in 2015 to be invited to Taipei to talk on the subject with other historians from around the world and from Japan and the United States. Look, it's a very important subject, because in our Western conceptions of the war in the Far East, we often ignore what you describe as the Cantonese, I describe as the Kuomintang, who were the organization, the legitimately elected, appointed government of China, who had an enormous problem on its hands in the 1930s. And they had very few friends. We need to remember that. Britain actually was an enemy of China because of its long-term intervention in Chinese affairs that went back a long time, of course. In the 1930s, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang didn't look favorably on Britain or on the British Empire because of this. And for a long period of time, from the time that the Japanese began involving itself militarily in China, and there are some very good books on this and very good studies in recent years, the Chinese were on their own. They were fighting the Japanese on their own. And in addition to fighting the Japanese on their own, remember, China had, from the second decade, had sort of collapsed into different fiefdoms. It was the fiefdoms coming together to be able to fight the Japanese, but also fight the rising communist threat under Mao Zedong. And I take my hat off, I really do, figuratively, to the Chinese who, for the whole of the 1930s, were fighting the first part of the Second World War on their own. And there is an enormous amount of arrogance. There was an enormous amount of arrogance, certainly in Britain at the time, about the Chinese. And I would say the Chinese never really, the British never really understood the Chinese position. And I think this is a significant flaw during the whole of the Second World War. Britain was focused on the Mediterranean and Europe and never really understood China. America, for all its strategic flaws in China, did understand what Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese were attempting to do. And in many respects, the Chinese involvement in Burma in 1942 was exemplary. The Chinese offered to send significant numbers of their own troops away from China into Burma to support the British defend Burma. The British rejected that concept initially under General Wavell, and it was a mistake by Wavell. So I think, to cut a long story short, the Kuomintang Chinese played a very significant role in fighting the Japanese, and we've forgotten it, and that's a problem. And I completely get the frustration of the Taiwan in particular, and of people who went to Taiwan after the war, that the world has forgotten the role of the Kuomintang in defending China as an entity, fighting Japan, and trying to prevent the overrunning of the country by the communists. And they're still under siege now. So many years after the war, of course, nothing much has changed with them. They are, as I discovered in 2015 when I was there, largely continuing to fight the Second World War. The American lifeline to the Chinese has continued because it's continued into Taipei, and that's a very interesting dynamic. And I think you talked about the Indo-Pacific, the security makeup in the Indo-Pacific region. It hasn't changed. It hasn't changed since 1942. It's largely the same. The Kuomintang Chinese have moved out of Chongqing and Yunnan, and they're now in Taiwan. So it's a very, very important point, and it's entirely forgotten. When I was there in 2015, I was told repeatedly that the world didn't understand the Kuomintang in 1941 and 42, and they don't understand it now. And I think that's true.
That's a really interesting point made on Taipei. And before we go with the very last question, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific again, this is a question which is related to the current circumstances. Now we know that there's enough rhetoric on the China-Taiwan issue in the Indo-Pacific context, and many people have argued from Washington that the White House should consider something with regards to Taiwan. Japan has tried to increase its commitments. India would obviously not directly state much about Taiwan, but they would focus on critical technologies and economy. So, but I believe one analysis has countered it in a very prudent manner, in which the person has stated that, okay, what practical circumstances are we ascertaining? So I think there's a much agreement with what you're trying to say when it comes to the status quo. And it's very true that when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, the same situation is with Taiwan. So even I had asked somebody in some same podcast a few episodes before, who has been a consultant in the Ministry of External Affairs in India, and I asked a simple question that, okay, Taiwan wants to cooperate with India, Taiwan wants to does a lot of the Indo-Pacific, but we just don't see anything beyond your economy, sustainability, COVID management, and other things which you have been talking about. Because we, in one of the episodes, somebody commented that Taiwan's problem is that with India, it has the same strategy on South China Sea, same strategy with respect to border issues when it was ROC properly in that sense. So what new is expected from them in a very strategic way? Because without that, I think even India is trying to do that through the Quad and through even its individual measures with France, Japan, and other so-called trilaterals. I think even I see the fact that Taiwan has not expressed much beyond that consensus which you're talking about. So if it could be possible, or if it's not, what do you see about the current scenario, the very present scenario?
Okay, I mean, for a number of years, I actually taught the subject in when I was living in the Far East. I was living on the island of Borneo in working in Brunei, and it's a very, very interesting subject, and I don't think much has changed. My argument would be along the lines of, look, multilateralism works. Multilateralist security, economic, and political structures work effectively. The most effective multilateral security organization in the world is NATO. NATO has worked very, very significantly But because countries have got together, and principally because Article 5 underpins NATO, which is that an attack on one country entails an attack on all, and it's a multilateral approach to the problem of national exceptionalism, and the national exceptionalism at the time came out of the Warsaw Pact. I think that the NATO model is directly applicable to the Indo-Pacific region. You have a whole number of individual countries, not least of all Taiwan and India and Malaysia and Singapore and the Republic of Korea, all with the same strategic interests and imperatives, but actually, and in many respects, particularly in ASEAN, cooperating economically and to a lesser degree politically. And I include Indonesia and the Philippines as well in that list. You all have the same interests ultimately, but your strategic interest, the expression of your strategic interest in all the countries in the region have been about protecting territorial integrity, not about operating in a multilateral sense. The issue for India, of course, is that you have got the non-aligned movement as a mantle on India's shoulders, and India does not want to get itself involved in multilateralism because India believes it will deny its own neutrality. We all have different views on that. I think moving into the next 20 to 40 years, multilateralism is the only way in which you're going to be able to protect the region from the pressures, the security pressures that are coming upon you, and we all know where they're coming from. So the idea of Chinese exceptionalism and China stepping outside of its own boundaries to demand control of the seas in particular, and to deny the passage of the seas to other states within the region, it can only be solved multilaterally. And security frameworks are very, very important and effective ways of doing that. And the great thing about multilateralism is that it's not about one country being dominant over the others. I think the great strength of NATO, I'm a great supporter of NATO, is in terms of its concept and in terms of what it's achieved, is the sense of collaboration and unity between the partners. I think the real challenge that the Indo-Pacific region has got, again, is the problem of the playground, and we often talk about this. There are bullies in the playground, and there are weaker members of the group in the playground who, without multilateral intervention, will be eaten up by the bullies, and that's the big danger. And I think we all know from history that unless we are able to protect our interests, then at the end of the spectrum is war. We're not saying that war is inevitable, but you have to control the weak end of the spectrum, the spectrum where you're engaging on a diplomatic basis about how you deal with each other. Because if you don't do that, you will end up in war. In my book, I argue that the failure of Britain in 1941-42 was a failure to protect its interests. It didn't have the armed forces or the military capability to do what it should have done. And I think that's a challenge now. If we see things simply as issues in the region as simply being economic or political, and we ignore the security dimension, we're going to fall into the trap of not being able to protect ourselves or protect our friends when the time comes.
Indeed. So I must say that the last question has been very effectively covered. So within that, the only portion which I would like to ask is about, I think somebody argued in one of my episodes here that India is a maritime power, very specifically speaking. It has not much to do with land issues. Of course, it has to do with border issues, but that's a different context altogether. But for example, let's take Afghanistan. I mean, the first country which has to deal the most here is Pakistan and then Iran, and not India directly. Even if let's say the POK would be back to India in some time or other, we don't know. Still, it would be a different question. So, considering that, how must we see the development? Is there any change possible to happen when it comes to the Indo-Pacific? Because one thing which interested me to have this interview at the first place was because we have seen that Indo-Pacific comes from the FIOP idea, which is led by the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. But I believe that this concept is not like just the Asia Pacific, because we all know that Asia Pacific, from a commercial aspect, is both about ASEAN and China, and it's not just Asia in that true sense. Sometimes India comes in, but I think Singapore, China, and all of those. So, is there? Can we say, from your estimation, when people read this book, people who would like to understand strategic thinking when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, because many people say it is sometimes impractical for them, sometimes it is also strategically reasonable for them. There are different views on it. Do you see that the Indo-Pacific, by its nature, by its course, is actually transforming now?
I think it should be, and there's every reason why it should be. I think that the question we all need to ask ourselves in our own states and our own organizations is, what are our interests? And I think India needs to do that as well. That original point about India being a maritime power, I agreed in part, but India is also a force projection power, and force projection is not just about its control of the seas and its maritime strategy, but about what forces it could project abroad to protect its interests. And I think that the point, I just go back to my earlier point about multilateralism, where countries identify their common interests. You have a national interest in India. You determine what those are. You come together in the Indo-Pacific to be able to determine what is common with other organizations, and of course I include Japan in that as well. It's a very, very important component. And certainly when I was teaching the subject many years ago, it's very, very difficult to find anything between the countries in the Indo-Pacific. You all want the same thing. You want peace and stability and security principally, and you want security from the depredations of the bully boys in the playground. So a sense of what the Indo-Pacific is important, but I entirely get the argument that there is no sense of that, of Asia as an entity, and that's what's got to be built up. These things don't happen in time, in a short period of time. They do happen over the long term, but I entirely get and understand the imperatives of people in the Indo-Pacific to actually create that sense of oneness, because it's important. If that doesn't develop at its various levels, political, economic, socially as well, and militarily, then of course the things that hold you together, your common interests, are much easily divided. Particularly when you have, one of the world's greatest powers in Asia sitting on your doorstep, or actually in your midst, trying to exert its prerogatives. That's the real challenge that the Indo-Pacific region faces now. It's creating an identity of itself and what it stands for, what its common interests are, and working out a way of bringing them together.
I must say this has been an amazing discussion, and those who go for a binge watch for this podcast, do not miss this. We will have some amazing episodes coming. Tomorrow on Indus Think, as we have the Independence Day of India tomorrow, we will be discussing the connect between Sanskrit, Urdu and Farsi with Dr. Balram Shukla, who is in IIS Shimla these days. So we will be discussing in another podcast show, which is Indus Think tomorrow at the same time. And a very surprise episode is going to come on Indus Think. So with this, we end Global Hint episode 5, season 2. Sir, we would happy to have you again, maybe in November, or maybe in some time once the book comes in and I start reading it. Maybe some new context come in. Maybe we could have a panel. It could be anything, but we will surely try to engage in the coming months. And it's really an honor to have you on board for the podcast. It was really amazing to have you.
It's been my pleasure to be with you this afternoon or this evening in India, and I wish you all the very best.
Thank you so much for that. So with this, we end the podcast. This episode is finished. Thank you so much for watching Internationalism Global Podcast. Reach out to us if you have any questions. Do not forget to have your YouTube comments. We'll look into it, and if possible, we'll try to get it to the speakers. And with this, I say never be the same. Know the